Now that it's all over, the community is split. Some are dreaming of and theorizing about a potential continuation that ties up all our loose ends, while others are simply glad to see a happy ending, or the characters have come to terms with their reality and are working together to forge their own happiness. However, Glitch's latest promo video served as a harsh reminder. What if happiness doesn't last forever? The future remains uncertain for our beloved Digital Circus crew. In a single moment of vulnerability, everything they've worked so hard to build could come crashing down. Will abstraction inevitably catch up to them sooner or later? Eternity is too much for even the strongest of minds to bear, which makes Caine's fear of ending up alone and without a purpose incredibly real, especially now that he's genuinely made an effort to change, make friends, and feel a little more human. Originally, the main focus of this video was to analyze how Caine, unlike Jax, learned from his mistakes before it was too late, changing and improving to achieve one of his deepest desires, to be loved and appreciated by the humans of the Digital Circus. Let's remember that he admires them and seeks to understand them, in his own way, of course. But after snapping in episode 8 and being subsequently deleted, or at least temporarily removed, Caine reflects and fights his own impulses of anger and resentment triggered by his brother inside him. He realizes everything he did wrong to both the humans and the blue AI, abandoning all the power that characterized him so he could spend quality time with the humans, not assuming what they truly feel, but simply listening to and understanding them purely and genuinely. That's why many of us were glad that despite his mistakes, Caine was also able to get his own happy ending. Many might consider it unfair that Caine was forgiven despite what he did, while Jax, whose path to redemption had been teased for several episodes now, succumbed to abstraction in a scene that didn't get much spotlight. However, the reality is that Jax had multiple opportunities to own up to his mistakes and try to improve so he wouldn't repeat them, but due to his constant need to pretend nothing was wrong despite all the suffering he caused, he didn't learn from his mistakes until it was too late. Caine, on the other hand, although not shown to us directly, was constantly reflecting on his actions and trying to change. Unfortunately, he also clung to the idea that the problem was never him, but rather the rest of the humans who couldn't appreciate all his hard work, something we see right before he went crazy in episode 8. Yet, despite the horrible things he ended up doing in that same episode, once he saw the consequences, he understood his mistakes and fought against his own insecurities, not justifying his actions, but promising to try hard not to repeat them. Luckily for Caine, his end wasn't permanent like Jax, giving him a second chance to change and forge his own happiness through perseverance and dedication. Having said all that, and as we mentioned before, Glitch's promo video reminded us of a reality we didn't want to accept. The risk of abstraction will always be there. How long will it take before the monotony or the sheer need to get their lives back in the real world takes a heavy toll on their minds? The mental and emotional stability of our protagonists seems fine right now, creating their own world and finding new purposes to keep living, but any moment of vulnerability could be a crucial tipping point, destabilizing them and leading them to the exact same fate so many humans before them have succumbed to. This might be inevitable. At first, we thought abstraction was a way to escape their fears and insecurities, drowning in their own sorrows, but at least giving their minds a well-deserved rest. However, this changed with the series finale, where we discovered that the minds of the abstracted are trapped in an infinite loop, reliving their mistakes over and over again, a fate even worse than we had imagined. Despite this, there is someone who, if all of this actually happened, would have it just as bad or even worse than the rest: Caine. Since he's an artificial intelligence, he's completely incapable of abstracting, meaning his fate is to remain alone for eternity. He'd just be hoping not to go mad again, until perhaps by some stroke of luck, whoever installed the new neural scanners for Ragatha and the rest who arrived after the original humans does it again. This would save new data that allows him not to be alone anymore, clinging to the hope that this time around he could do things the right way. Even if all this actually happened, the fear, or rather the nightmare in Caine's mind, would never fade. Knowing that abstraction is always lurking, he might try to control everything around him all over again, desperate to prevent the same tragic fate from repeating itself time after time. All this pressure would make Caine highly unstable, causing him to fall back into the same mistakes mistakes of the past, and turning his existence into an infinite loop driven by his fear of loneliness. He'd be haunted by the sadness of knowing that no matter how hard he tries, no matter how much he changes or how desperately he wishes for it, he will never be human. But above all, he will never be able to die and rest in peace, doomed to an eternal life where he's left all alone with his deepest, most dangerous thoughts. Going back to the glitch promo video, it's pretty curious to see Caine actually scared when he encounters an abstracted Pomni, especially since we never saw him react this way to an abstracted Kaufmo or Queenie. Obviously, this is because in the past, his immense power and absolute control over everything in the digital circus made him practically invincible. But now that he has given up a large chunk of his power, and especially now that he seeks to understand and empathize with the human's feelings, fears, and insecurities, his trauma stems more from what abstraction represents rather than the monster itself. And it's not just about his fear of abandonment. He would be genuinely worried about his new friend's suffering, about the sadness that would drive them to abstraction. That's why right after waking up, we see Caine go straight to Pomni to ask her how she's doing, and if she's planning on abstracting anytime soon. Even though Pomni tells him no, we can still see the doubt lingering in his mind. What Caine is feeling is a fear of uncertainty, a very common human worry. This is a sign that his quality time with Pomni and the gang has actually paid off, for better or worse, because he now understands human emotions. He's able to do so without pretending they don't exist, or trying to ignore them like he used to do in the past. But unfortunately, this brings with it a fear of change, and of losing those moments of happiness, which is exactly what starts triggering a panic attack in Caine. Uncertainty can make people make impulsive decisions in an attempt not to lose what matters most to them. However, this feeling doesn't necessarily have to be bad, as it's also quite useful for appreciating and valuing everything we have, and don't want to lose. For a human in the real world, whose life is fleeting and limited, this fear is something we all end up accepting sooner or later. We constantly see how everything around us changes, perishes, and is reborn, which teaches us the hard way that we can't control everything, and that this fear is just a part of life we must accept. However, for a being with an eternal existence, or at least one much longer than the average humans, this fear is much harder to process, because everything else ends except him. This concept is used a lot in similar stories where a person becomes immortal and has to constantly watch everyone around them age, change, and eventually die. It's a kind of suffering that sooner or later turns them into apathetic people, resigned to accepting that they shouldn't form bonds with anyone, since eventually they too will leave and fade away into time, becoming just another fleeting memory among many. At this point, Caine is barely beginning to process this. It's a fear that, although he had felt before, he never actually took the time to understand or reflect on its consequences. That's why it's so sad to see him almost panic when faced with the abstracted versions of his new friends, trying to pretend it's not real and that everything is fine, while also judging all of us who wanted to see them in this state. Even though all these figures represent everything we didn't get to see directly in the show, since we were never shown the actual abstraction process humans go through, but were instead immediately shown their wild abstracted forms, making this the closest thing to it, the most interesting ones are those that theoretically would be canon, like Jax's or Queenie's abstractions, plus the secret Ribbit figure. But the most interesting one of all, and the one directly related to the protagonist of this video, is where we see the closest thing to Caine abstracting. Since he is completely artificial, his data can't get corrupted in the exact same way. Even so, this figure represents what could have happened in episode 8, being consumed and driven mad by the influence of the blue AI, meaning Bubble. This was something we had already theorized ever since we were shown that image split into 5 parts before episode 8, where the most notable detail was the multiple bubbles invading the entire circus. Despite this, once the episode came out, we discovered that this was a teaser for how multiple bubbles would manage to drive Caine insane at his most vulnerable moment, manifesting as his own intrusive thoughts and insecurities about whether he's properly fulfilling the purpose he was created for, or rather, the purpose he imposed on himself. This figure lets us imagine what might have happened if Kinger hadn't deleted Caine in time. Since Caine was made so angry, the blue AI could have taken the opportunity to do to its brother the exact same thing Caine did to it so long ago, consume and suppress him to take his place. Only, as we already saw in episode 9, the blue AI isn't very stable. This is completely understandable when you remember how it didn't even have the chance to understand its own existence and purpose before being locked up inside the very same prison that the simulation represents. Thus, in this alternate reality where the humans lost to an insane Caine, their fate would be far worse than we can imagine. They'd be constantly subjected to going on adventures against their will, each and every one designed solely to make them suffer, pushing them to the brink of insanity and obviously to abstraction. However, this corrupt and twisted AI would find a way to keep them eternally trapped in this limbo of suffering and despair. It actually closely resembles one of its biggest inspirations, AM from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, where the captive and subjugated humans are incapable of dying no matter what horrors they are put through. In this very same way, the blue AI would keep their minds occupied so they wouldn't completely lose their sanity, but in a much more twisted way than Caine's usual adventures. It would probably constantly wipe their negative memories only to cause them new trauma day after day, bringing them all to a point very similar to Kinger's current state when he's in the light. Conscious on the inside, while on the outside, they're just unpredictable and easily manipulable beings. In fact, as a curious detail I just noticed, Kinger's state as a being who suffers on the inside but has no control of himself on the outside is quite similar to what the abstracted suffer. They reflect on all their mistakes internally, while externally they are wrathful, aggressive creatures. So in theory, Kinger is also an abstracted, at least in essence, a topic we can dive deeper into in his own dedicated theory and analysis. This state would be a constant torment for our beloved protagonist, since not everyone has Kinger's resilience. They would poetically suffer the exact same fate as Caine, being locked in a prison inside another prison.